Well, if that has ever happened to you, it looks like you've been Xanter's peaked. So, you want to learn how to do that? What's up, ProGuides fam? I'm Tia, and today we're looking at everything you need to know about peaking. In CSGO, there's a few different ways of peaking, each with different goals, advantages, and disadvantages. Let's stop wasting time and go over each of them.
Hey everybody, Kangas here. Real quick, just hopping in to let you know that we have a 25% off discount going on the website right now. All you gotta do is go check out and enter in the code FPS25 to get 25% off your subscription. It's an insane deal. You're not gonna want to miss it out, so go check it out. All right, back to the video.
In the first style of peaking to simply get a fight, there's essentially 3 different peaks. Let's start with the regular close peak, so the one where you methodically clear angles. The technique used for this peak is usually called slicing the pie, which stems from the goal that you're trying to achieve. Of course, it's not a literal pie, sad face, but rather you're trying to splice up the angles you're peaking to only peak one at a time. Your goal here is to get isolated 1 versus 1s while exposing as little of your body as possible to make sure that your opponent on paper has the most difficult shot to hit. Due to geometry, this also means that you should try to be as far away from the angle you're peaking as possible. If you're close to an object and your opponent is farther away, they'll be able to see you before you'll be able to see them. It's the same in real life. Try it out for yourself. For example, stand close to a door frame and slowly edge yourself out until you see a friend or family member in the living room. Assuming you just imagine that scenario in your head, you probably realize that indeed your arm, shoulder, and a good chunk of your body will be spotted before you spot the person sitting on the couch. But if you didn't and don't really know what I'm referring to still, don't be afraid to quickly pause the video and try it out. Alright, now that's settled, how should we actually do that peak? So in order to successfully slice the pie, there's a few things to keep in mind. First of all, you have to know the map. If you don't know what's around the corner and whether or not there could be an opponent there, you will not be able to peek it properly. That's because you're, again, trying to show as little of your body as possible, meaning you won't wait to see what's around the corner, but instead preemptively counter-strafe in order to not over-peek. Like we just mentioned in the part about geometry, you need to be as far away from the angle again to make sure as little of your body is exposed as possible. And finally, something that's important is that you do a fast peek, so you don't shift walk around the corner. In the lower ranks, I noticed that a lot of people don't seem to realize that you almost never want to peek an angle shift walking. Of course, we understand that you don't want to make noise and give away your position, but being silent and peeking fast can go hand in hand. You only really start making noise by running once you run a decent distance, meaning that you can normally peek without holding shift, peek fast, and not make noise. All of this can be practiced simply using the YPrac practice maps on the pre-fire mode, which you can find in the Steam Workshop. In this map, you can experiment with all the different angles where CTs like to play and clear them out methodically. It's very important here that you only peek one angle at a time, which you can force yourself to do by setting your health to a fairly low setting and allowing the bots to shoot back. Aside from simply learning the maps, you can also experiment here with counter-strafing as tight as possible and leaving the most space between you and the angle you're peeking. And of course, you can also practice peeking fast without using shift or making sound. Just pay attention to whether or not you hear your own footsteps, and if you don't, you're good to go. The close peek is a great peek to start with as it forces you to develop great fundamentals and doesn't have a lot of downsides. Its main strength is that you can always be sure that you're only peeking one person at a time and don't find yourself in a 2v1 gunfight. And on top of that, it's also great for silently, methodically, and carefully clearing a lot of angles without giving up your position. The only real weakness of it though is that it's pretty predictable. Most people generally tend to peek using the standard method, and for good reason. But it does mean that people are going to expect it. The higher the matchmaking ladder you go, the better players become, and with that, also especially crosshair placement. And since peeking close is the standard, most people in those ranks will have their crosshair pre-positioned to counter those close peeks, meaning it will be a bit less effective. Alright, that's it for the standard peek. Before we move on though, first we have to cover our question of the day. Today's question being, do you play with a team or do you prefer to solo queue? Personally, I used to always love to solo queue, but nowadays I just like to play with my friends and have a good time. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below. I said the standard methodical peek was predictable, but of course, I also got you covered when it comes to what you can use instead. That being the wide peek, also known as Ferrari peek or sometimes even Xanter's peek. This style of peeking basically gets rid of everything we learned from the standard methodical peek and and is in many ways the complete opposite. The wide peak isn't silent, you try to get as close as possible to the wall instead of the other way around, and even crosshair placement works slightly differently here. The goal of the wide peak is to get ahead of your opponent's crosshair placement and drive by like a Ferrari, only to headshot them. To your opponent, it basically looks like you're running and gunning, but that's actually not the case. How this peak works is pretty simple. You get as close to the wall you're about to peek from as you can in order to maximize the speed you're going to be moving at on your opponent's screen. And on top of that, you try to pre-aim the angle you're about to peek. Basically, just imagine for a second that you have wall hacks and place your crosshair exactly on the head where you expect the CT to be holding and swing out. Then once you see the player, counter-strafe and click on their heads, and ta-da! You'll have successfully sent your opponent to the shadow dimension. The wide peak is fun, it's daring, and it's super effective once you get good at it. But it does have a few downsides. First of all, yeah, you're not really silent, and if you wide peak every angle, you're going to be making a lot of noise. Thus, you only really want to peek like it if you know for certain there's an enemy there, or if it doesn't matter if you make steps. On top of that, it also has the downside of opening yourself up to the risk of peeking multiple players all at once, which will usually result in a quick death. But perhaps most importantly, it's really difficult to practice wide peeking, at least on your own. Unlike with a standard peek, there's no good ways to practice it on a custom map, so you're probably going to have to practice it in real games. But we all know that isolated practice is both a lot more effective and efficient, so it's not really optimal. So what you need instead is a player to practice your wide peeks with. You could do it with a friend, but what we'd advise doing, since it's a lot more effective and you'll be able to fix any mistakes with your newly learned technique as they come up instead of after you incorporate bad habits, is doing it together with a coach. Head on over to our website, ProGuides.com. We have plenty of great and experienced coaches that will be able to help you practice this technique. They can tell you what you're doing wrong, and you'll be able to use your time a lot more efficiently, meaning you'll be able to pick up the technique faster with fewer mistakes and better execution. And honestly, it's just a lot more fun to practice together with a coach. The third way of peeking is actually pretty similar to the last two, at least with what you're trying to achieve, and it's the crouch peek. When you crouch peek, you can do it for two reasons. Either you want to crouch peek a bit like we just talked about to offset the crosshair placement of your opponents. When you do this, you want to swing out wide and crouch decisively, forcing your opponents to flick down. Or you can do it the other way and use it more like the standard peek, in which case you slowly crouch peek out, exposing yourself to the angle slightly more every time as you slowly crab walk around the corner. This kind of peek is really effective when you know your opponent is very close to cover, and you want to be able to kill them without them being able to see you. This works, for example, when you're crouch walking out Tetris on Mirage, pre-aiming for someone default box, or for example, if you know someone is hiding at oranges on B-site Inferno. The main perk of crouch peeking is that it gives you a really big advantage if you use it right, but you probably already guessed it. It's also more punishing if you use it wrong. So only use it when you know it's the right call. Okay, now that you have a pretty good idea on how to use the right peeks to pick up kills, let's go over the second style, the one to get information. The first and most commonly used peek in this category is the Jiggle Peak. A Jiggle Peak is when you quickly peek and unpeek angles, going a bit wider every time in order to get information where your opponents are. It's really strong against riflers that like to hold angles, since if you do it properly, you barely give them time to shoot you, but nonetheless, you are able to scout out their location. Basically, this technique is used to find out where your opponent is playing to, then hit them with another peek, normally a wide one. It works pretty well in most scenarios, but it struggles against one thing specifically, and that's oppers. If you jiggle an opper, you're almost always going to die, at least if they're quick enough, which will be the case in almost every rank. Perhaps you already saw it coming, but there's also something to deal with that weakness, and that's shoulder peeking. Shoulder peeking and jiggle peeking is believed to be the same thing by a fairly large portion of the community, but it couldn't be further from the truth. The main difference between the two is that with a jiggle peek, you'll be able to spot your enemies, and with a shoulder peek, you won't. A shoulder peek is a lot more tight and is designed to give you info by making an opper miss their shot, at which point you'll be able to frag them. Similar to wide peeking though, this is again really hard to practice and not exactly easy to perform, especially at first. Jiggle peeking is pretty straightforward since you're trying to spot the enemy on your screen. But with the shoulder peek, you won't be able to see your enemy, at least not if you're doing it properly, and honestly, it's difficult to get a feel for since it's not very intuitive. For me, it took a really long time to learn to do, and I can honestly say that it lost me a lot of games. You know, just dying to hoppers. Yay. But by just spending a few minutes with a coach, you'll be able to quickly learn how to do it, when it would normally cost you like hundreds of hours practicing. To practice this, simply have your coach hold different angles while you try to shoulder peek them. At first, you'll probably peek out a bit too far, or maybe even not far enough. But with this isolated practice, you should be able to pick up the skill pretty quickly.
Well, that's it. Thanks for watching, ProGuides fam. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure you leave a like, subscribe, and head on over to ProGuides.com to sign up with one of our coaches that I mentioned before. Once again, I'm Tia. Best of luck grinding, and I'll see you soon.